Hi everyone, welcome to the first pantry challenge video of the year. You guys asked for it, so I'm doing it again this year, and I'll be giving you some recipe ideas and I'll be showing you what recipes I made throughout the week using some of the ingredients from our pantry. These are going to be pantry inspired meals, so I'm going to start each week out with a few ingredients that I've pulled out, usually trying to highlight a lot of the things that we grew ourselves and preserved throughout 2023, and then I'm going to build out some meal ideas around those ingredients. So let's get started with the 4 meals I'm going to be showing you in this video, starting with the ingredients. These are a few ingredients that I pulled out that I want to use this week. First, I have some red lentils. I'm going to be making a couple of different recipes with this. Then I want to eat up one of our homegrown Dutch crookneck squashes, which is basically like a butternut squash. And I'm starting to incorporate a lot of the frozen vegetables that I preserved this year. So for this week, I pulled out this bag of frozen shredded zucchini. And then I had also opened a jar of this balsamic caramelized onions to put on burgers last week. So we're going to use up more of this jar in another recipe. So those are just a few things that I pulled out. Obviously, I'm going to be pulling more from the pantry and the fridge and everything, but I usually start with like a few ingredients that I want to find uses for, and then I usually build my meals around the things that I pull out and choose. So let's get started with the first recipe, which I think is like the most basic thing, maybe just because I make this so often, but this is going to be a butternut squash soup. And this is my go-to recipe for using butternut squash, or in this case, Dutch crookneck squash, which really tastes the same as a butternut squash. So any kind of winter squash that kind of tastes like a butternut squash will be great in soup. And I'm starting off by prepping off my squash by just peeling the entire squash. I find it easiest to separate it into like the neck and the bulb part and peel those separately. You can see that on the inside of the squash, my squash is starting to get just slightly spongy in texture as it's getting older, which is why I really wanted to use this up sooner rather than later. And usually by the time we're like into the new year, I like to try and use up all of the winter squash that we grew from the year before. I'm chopping my squash into fairly large chunks. They don't have to be very small because we are going to be blending this later on. And then I'm going to go ahead and remove the seeds and any stringy bits from the inside of the squash. So I've prepped my squash, and in addition to that, I have also chopped up 3 to 4 ribs of celery, 1 onion that I've cut into large chunks, and then I also have about 6 cloves of garlic and 2 bay leaves. I have a large pot with a few tablespoons of extra virgin olive oil in there, and I'm going to put in my onions, celery, and garlic at this point and let those saute for a few minutes. I'm keeping this soup pretty simple, and I'm going to be seasoning with salt, pepper, and some crushed red pepper flakes. Once those vegetables have softened and have started to brown, I'm going to add in all of my butternut squash. And this was a pretty large squash, so it's definitely going to be making a very large batch of soup. I'm adding in some salt now to season this, and then I will be adding water, just barely enough to cover the squash. I don't want to add too much water because then it will be too watery at the end when we blend this up. So if anything, I like to err on the side of less water. I also added in my bay leaves, and then I'm going to be adding about a tablespoon of this Better Than Bouillon chicken broth paste. This is something that is an absolute must for me during soup season when I am going through so much chicken broth, and it just has a really good flavor. If you're not using this, you can just have used chicken or vegetable broth, whatever you prefer, instead of adding just water. So now I just have to cover the pot and let all of the vegetables soften up completely, which is going to take about 15 to 20 minutes. And once that's done, you can see that the squash is really nice and tender. And before we blend this up, don't forget to take out your bay leaves so that you don't blend up the bay leaves as well. So I fish those out, and then I'm going to be using my immersion blender to blend this up until it's really nice and smooth and creamy. Once everything is all blended up, I like to do a taste test at this point, and I did need just a little bit more salt, so I added that in. And if the soup is too thin for your liking, you can also just reduce it down by simmering it for a little while longer with the lid off. But I'm gonna call that soup good, and to finish off our meal, we have some freshly baked bread, as well as some spicy pickles on the side. So that is the super quick and simple winter squash soup that I make all the time. It's a really great weeknight meal. And since I made such a big pot of that and I had a lot of leftovers for the week, the next recipe I'm going to show you is something that I made to go along with the soup the next day, and it's going to be a mushroom and caramelized onion jam tart. I'm starting off with a skillet with a few tablespoons of olive oil. I've added in a pinch of red pepper flakes, and then I added about 10 to 12 ounces of white mushrooms that I've sliced, and then I'm going to add a half teaspoon of salt to this. The mushrooms have a lot of volume in the beginning, but they shrink down a lot and they will release a lot of moisture, so sauteing them before adding them to the tart is really essential so that it doesn't make the puff pastry that we're going to be using soggy at the bottom. So I'm gonna let those cook off, and you can see how they're already starting to shrink and they're releasing a lot of their moisture, but I'm gonna go until they're completely cooked down and starting to brown. Meanwhile, I have a puff pastry sheet that I have defrosted at room temp for 30 to 40 minutes. It's nice and pliable now, so I'm going to unfold this and roll it out to be slightly larger. And store-bought puff pastry is definitely one of those things that I think is worth getting store-bought. I am not really interested in making my own puff pastry. I've tried a couple times and it just never comes out that great, and it's a lot of work. So definitely one of those things that's just great to buy at the store and stash it away in your freezer because you can put together some really quick meals with the puff pastry. So this is what I'm going to be using as like the crust part of my tart. So once I've rolled it out just slightly, I don't want it too thin, but I do want to make it a little bit larger and easier to work with. I'm going to lay that on my baking sheet with a sheet of parchment paper and set that aside in the fridge while I put together the rest of the filling so that it stays really nice and cold. So here's what my mushrooms look like now. They have fully cooked down and are starting to brown, and I'm taking them off the heat to add in my onions. And I've got about half a jar of these balsamic caramelized onions that I canned just this past year. This is a recipe that I just tried out for the first time, and I really like how this came out, so I would definitely do it again. But if you don't have this in your pantry because you haven't made this, you can always just caramelize onions before you saute off your mushrooms. It'll just take longer because caramelized onions take like 40 minutes to cook down. So this was really quick and easy for me to put together because I had already done the work beforehand and I could just add it into my mushrooms. And the jam has so much flavor to add to the mushrooms. There's also balsamic vinegar in there, so that's going to add flavor as well. So all in all, this is a very flavorful filling for our tart. Although I think this would also be really good with just mushrooms because mushrooms have a lot of umami flavor as well. But anyway, I have mixed in the rest of my jar in with the mushrooms. So I'm spreading out the mushroom and onion filling over my puff pastry, trying to spread it as evenly as possible until about an inch from the sides. And I'm just going to very simply fold over about an inch of each of the sides of my puff pastry, and then I'm going to place this in a 400-degree oven to bake for about 20 minutes. This is what the tart looks like when it comes out. The puff pastry has puffed up really nicely. You can see all of those beautiful layers, and it's not soggy at the bottom at all because I've cooked off all of that moisture from the mushrooms. And just to give this a little bit of nice color and freshness, I top this off with some chopped scallions, and then I'm going to slice this off into triangles. And then just because I had some burrata in the fridge, I topped off the mushroom and onion tart with one of these balls of burrata that I am opening up. And the creaminess and mild flavor of the cheese paired really nice with this because the balsamic onion jam does have quite a strong tart flavor, so the cheese just melded really nicely with that. And then I served this with some of our leftover butternut squash soup that we had, as well as some dilly beans. So that was the complete meal. I think this was a really great thing to whip up to go along with our leftover soup because we were out of bread and I wanted something fresh to serve along with the soup to keep it interesting. And I think you'll really see that this is a theme in this video and just in general with my cooking. A lot of times when I come up with things to make, I'm basing it off of leftovers that we already have in the fridge, and I'm usually just making something new to go along with the leftovers. That way you get to eat your leftovers, but you also get to eat something new, and you're not just eating the same thing every day. This also makes cooking a lot more mentally manageable for me because sometimes it can be overwhelming thinking that I want to make like 2 or 3 things that each have their own steps. So this way I can just concentrate on making one thing and then the other thing is already made. The next recipe is going to be another soup, because basically we just have soup nonstop at this point of the year. This one is going to be a curried red lentil and coconut soup. And in a pot, I'm starting off with a few tablespoons of coconut oil. I'm adding in 1 onion that I've diced up, and I'm going to let that saute in the coconut oil for a little bit. I'm also adding salt and pepper, of course. Once the onions have started to soften a bit, I'm going to add in the rest of my aromatics, which is going to be 4 to 5 cloves of garlic, as well as about a 1-inch piece of ginger that I have minced up. I'm going to give this another couple of minutes, and then I'm going to be adding some more spices. I've got about a 1/4 teaspoon of crushed red pepper flakes, and then I'm going to be adding 3 teaspoons of curry powder, which is going to be like the main flavor profile for this soup. And it's going to be super fragrant. I'm going to let those spices bloom for a minute, and then I'm going to add in 2 cups of red lentils that I've soaked overnight and then I've drained. Then I'm going to add about a cup of water and some salt and a bay leaf, and I'm just going to let those red lentils soften up. Again, I didn't want to add too much liquid here. I am going to be adding coconut milk later on, so I don't want this to be too watery right up front. It's always easier to add water than it is to boil excess water out, but I just let that cook for about 10 to 15 minutes until the red lentils have soaked up all of that liquid, and then once they have, I added in 1 can of coconut milk, which is going to add a lot more liquid to this pot and let the red lentils continue cooking. I usually like to wait kind of towards the end to add any milk, cream, or coconut milk to any soups, because they can kind of get a little weird and curdly if they are boiled at too high of a heat for too long. So that's why I kind of like left it towards the end. And then I also usually like to add some water to my can of coconut milk, swish it around, and then get any of that leftover coconut milk out of the can. So I added that in as well. So now we're gonna have plenty of liquid to continue cooking our lentils. I also added in about a teaspoon of my Better Than Bouillon chicken broth concentrate. Like I told you, I just use this all the time whenever I'm making soup. That way I never have to worry about having chicken broth defrosted, and I just needed a little bit of that to add some more flavor to the soup. And then after about 10 minutes, you can see how the lentils are really completely soft now. The soup is really nice and thick and is pretty much done at this point. And just because I had some fresh spinach from the garden, I'm adding a couple of handfuls of spinach to the soup, and I'm letting that wilt down to finish off the soup, but you can also go without the spinach if you don't have that, and the soup is still really delicious. But that's the finished soup. It's a super hearty one and very flavorful with the curry powder and the coconut milk. To top it off, I had also reserved just a few spoonfuls of the coconut milk that I'm going to top off the soup with, just to make it really nice and pretty. And I'm just doing a few swooshes of that on top of each of the bowls of soup. This soup recipe is a new one that I have just tried out and discovered, and I really love this one, and I'm going to be adding it to my list of go-to pantry recipes. Pretty much everything in there is a pantry ingredient, so it's really nice to make kind of at the last minute. You can of course have the soup with bread, which is our go-to, but I had some leftover latkes that I had made previously in the week, so I just reheated those up to have along with the soup. And it was a really nice accompaniment. Just ignore our untraditional way of eating latkes, which is just with ketchup and not with sour cream or applesauce, because I don't know, I think a latke basically is just like a french fry, which we eat with ketchup, so I think in our brains it like tastes best with ketchup. But anyway, that was the finished curried red lentil and coconut soup, which was really delicious. And again, we had leftovers for a few more days for the week, so the next thing I'm going to be showing you is something I whipped up to go with those leftovers once again, and I'm going to be making some red lentil and zucchini fritters. And I'm kind of saving the best for last with this one because it was definitely one of my favorite things that I made that week. I'm starting off with 2 cups of red lentils that I have soaked overnight, and I'm putting those into my food processor. These are uncooked lentils, they've just been soaked, and I'm going to pulse these until they are really nicely blended up, and they should sort of just like make a paste at this point. I was really interested in trying out this way to cook up red lentils because it really reminds me of my favorite way of making falafel, which is with dried soaked chickpeas rather than using fully cooked through chickpeas and then you fry those up to make the falafel. We're pretty much going to be doing the same thing just with red lentils, and this is going to be inspired by an Indian red lentil fritter, so a lot of the spices we're going to be incorporating are inspired by that. And when I've made falafel this way in the past, it comes out so crispy and the texture is so good. So those were my hopes for the red lentils in this recipe, and I think they turned out to be a success. So anyway, the red lentils are nicely blended up now. You can kind of see the texture is like mushy and kind of like a paste, but definitely on the dry side, which is great for frying. So I've removed the red lentils, put them in a mixing bowl, and I've added 1 onion that I've diced up, and then I'm going to be adding my package of frozen shredded zucchini that I showed you at the beginning of the video. This has been defrosted and I've drained out all of the water and squeezed out any excess water that I could to keep this as dry as possible, because when you're frying, you don't want any extra moisture in there that can splatter in the oil. To season this up, I put in 1 teaspoon of salt, and then I pretty much just raided my spice cabinet and put in anything that I thought would taste good. I'm starting off with a pinch of asafoetida, which is basically like Indian MSG, and really helps to bump up any like oniony allium flavor. Then I added in 1 teaspoon of coriander powder, half a teaspoon of garam masala, a sprinkle of turmeric, and 1 teaspoon of Kashmiri chili powder, as well as a few cracks of black pepper. Feel free to add or remove any spices you want or don't have. I'm not really following a specific recipe, I just added what I thought would sound good, so just add whatever you think sounds good. I'm gonna mix this all together so that the spices are nicely blended and the vegetables are evenly distributed. And this is going to be our fritter mixture. You can see how it's just like a really beautiful dry texture that is so nice for frying. And it also kind of sticks together really nicely. It doesn't really need a lot of manipulating to like be formed into a patty or a ball, which is really nice. So in a frying pan, I have 1 inch of neutral oil that I've heated to 350 to 360 degrees, and I'm just gonna start dropping in spoonfuls of my red lentil and vegetable mixture to fry off in this oil, just doing a few fritters at a time so that I don't drop the oil temperature down too much. And usually if I have any pieces that are like floating away, I try and catch those and add them to some of my existing fritters, just because if any pieces are floating away on their own, they can start to brown and burn in the oil. So I'm just gonna let the first side fry for 3 to 4 minutes until it's nicely golden brown, and then I'm going to gently flip those, and the other side is going to cook for another 2 minutes. And I really like how when you kind of have like craggy edges when you fry things, you get a lot of crispy edges, which is why I try and drop these in with like kind of loose spoonfuls, because then you get more of those craggy edges to fry off rather than trying to form it into like a perfect patty or a perfect ball that's round all over. And plus it also just helps to keep your hands clean, which is a bonus. So I'm just gonna keep going through my whole mixture until everything is fried off. And while I was frying off, it just smelled so good with all of the spices getting activated with the oil. So of course I had to try one out, and it was so delicious. The outside was so nicely crispy and the inside is really fluffy and creamy, and there's just so much flavor with all of those spices in there. So I think I came up with a pretty good combination of spices, just throwing in lots of random things there. This batter was also just such a pleasure to fry because there was so little moisture, so there was very minimal scary oil splattering. Here's my finished platter of fritters. I had so many that I even had some to stash away in the freezer for a later date, which was awesome. And I really did want to serve this with some like yogurt sauce, but I had just used up all of my yogurt, so instead I pulled out another ball of burrata, which I thought would work well with this because it's nice and creamy, kind of like yogurt is, and it did go really well with this, so maybe a little bit of an untraditional choice, but it worked out really well. I topped off the burrata with some salt and pepper just to season it up, and then I served this with some of our leftover red lentil soup. These fritters were definitely a winner. I am really glad that I kind of like doubled the recipe from what I've seen online. A lot of people say to use just like 1 cup of red lentils, but I did the 2 cups because I think that if you're gonna go through the trouble of making something like this and doing some frying, you might as well make plenty of extra because you can always have leftovers throughout the week or freeze some for a later use. Alright, so those are the 4 recipes that I have to share with you in this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know if you try out any of these meals, and I'll see you again in the next video.